Seven, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast. Hello and welcome to the History with Jackson podcast, the podcast where we bring up-to-date historical research to you in an accessible and digestible way. So hello and welcome back to the History with Jackson podcast. Today we welcome author and historian Allen Fromherz to discuss his book, and I absolutely love this book, The Centre of the World, a global history of the Persian Gulf from the Stone Age to the present. I've got my copy here. It's an absolutely fantastic cover as well.
Yes.
So how are you doing, Allen?
Oh, doing great. Thank you so much, Jackson. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
No worries at all. You know, I'm really excited to get stuck into looking at different areas of history which help contextualize a lot of things that are going on in the world today. But I think the first question I want to ask you is a bit of a cliche question, but what inspired you to write this book?
Great question, Jackson. I have a bit of a backstory, a personal story related to what inspired me to do this book. The first book that came out that I wrote on this region was actually Qatar, A Modern History, which is published by Georgetown, IB Tauris in England. The reason I wanted to write that book is because while I was a professor at Qatar University, I realized that there really weren't any good books on Qatar itself that had been written in the past few decades. There was one book by Rosemary Saeed Zahlan, who's related to Edward Said, of course, but there hadn't been any books to tackle all the major, massive changes that have been going on. And just this extraordinary, I think even epic-making developments that were happening in Qatar and happening in the Gulf, really centering not just the region, but much of the world on these transformations that were happening, for good or for ill, depending on what perspective or what background you might be or might have. So I, a little bit ambitiously, but with the encouragement of my publisher, said, sure, why don't I write a history of Qatar? I'll be there, I'll be teaching there, I'll have my students who really inspired me. And one of the things that I really learned from my students who are Qatari themselves, this is actually quite rare to teach Qataris, because if you go to the US campuses or British campuses in Education City, most of your student body is actually not Qatari, right? But at Qatar University, they are Qatari, and they tend not to be from the ruling family or the ruling Al Thani family. Many of the Al Thani go to Education City instead. And it's more sort of traditional local kind of experience. There's a separation of the sexes, and most of the classes are in Arabic. But what I gained an appreciation of while I was at Qatar University in 2008, 2009 is the lasting importance and the sort of underestimated importance of these traditional networks of society that existed and still exist within Gulf polities, within Gulf society. These informal networks, they're not necessarily written down in places, but they are still driving how decisions are made and how citizens in particular, so local Qataris, have a voice or an influence in their government. And even though if you look strictly at the constitution of some of these countries, you see that the emir is supposed to be the only authority on so many things. But if you look at how things and decisions are actually made, you see that there's still this reference to obligations of consultation, of bringing in different, what we call tribal groupings, different families and different interests that have existed and have supported this system of really first among equals, but not higher than us in their relationship to the ruler. So I think that was sort of eye-opening to me, and to understand the importance of these family histories, to see that even some of these families had emirs of their own before the state emir kind of took over and consolidated those different claims. The importance of these families, these tribes, in making territorial claims, which is crucial in this region, because wherever you have land, you also have potential oil. And only in the past few decades have those boundaries been set and negotiated, and they're still being negotiated in many instances. Where does Qatar begin in Saudi Arabia, and where does Bahrain even in the maritime system? Oftentimes that is based upon whether you can say, well, this family, this Dawasser tribe, pledged allegiance to us in this period, right? Therefore, we can say that this land that they used to roam in, even before they even knew that there might be vast amounts of oil wealth, can be reasonably claimed to be part of Qatar, right? But so it's based upon those very particular relationships and mutual obligations that these sort of polities come into being. So that I found really interesting and against sort of the patterns and expectations of, well, these are totalitarian or authoritarian or these are paternalistic societies. That's not strictly the case. There's more complexity there. And also just the history of commerce and the emphasis on commerce and on trade and international connectivity that has been the bread and butter of these initially small sort of city-states, sometimes growing into big ports along the shore of the Persian Gulf, and how they've maintained autonomy from different empires and sort of they've been these ancient times, these sort of free trade zones. I found that very interesting as well. So it's tempting to look at the modern Gulf, and that's what I thought when I first went there. Oh, this is all just completely new. It almost seems artificial. Maybe it's imposed. Maybe it's some sort of Western plot or something, or it's because of their alliance with the United States. But no, it's actually this embrace of capitalism and international labor, and international flow of capital is an ancient institution, longer set and around much longer than anything in barbarian Europe had, especially in 3000 BC or during the first centuries of the Common Era. So I think that was all very eye-opening. And I realized we needed also a book about the whole Gulf. Why isn't there a book about this region that has a lot of similarities culturally, even though there's a lot of divisions that are claimed at different times? This is true of a lot of history, where you have what appear to be really stark divisions, say between the Crusaders and then Salah ad-Din, and you realize, actually, though, by their interaction and by their conflict, they are sharing and becoming and creating a common cultural legacy. And that, I think, can be argued when it comes to the many centuries of supposed intractable conflict between Persia and Arabia, that in fact they have combined in the Persian Gulf this combined culture of Persian Arab. And then on top of that, you have layers of South Asian influence coming as well. So it's a fascinating center of the world, is what I argue.
I really like how that's a combination of your personal journey, seeing that there's no book and actually wanting to write the books yourself, but also, that complexity kind of scaring off Western scholars from wanting to kind of get stuck into this region and learn more, but show off the connectivity. And that connectivity, I think, is a really important point that I really want to dive into here is, you were talking about the trade of the Gulf region, how it has these free trade kind of areas. Why does it become such an important trade area? Because traditionally, when we think of international trade at this time, we start to think of the Silk Road and that important land channel. But this seems to be striking at a misconception that we might have.
Well, yeah, for sure. I mean, if you look at land routes, oftentimes the land routes are only used if you can't find an easy and safe way across the sea, because it's so much faster, especially in the pre-modern period, and so much more efficient. And of course, you have the benefit of the monsoon wind cycle, which propels these merchants across vast distances of the Indian Ocean, and into which the Persian Gulf is kind of like the stomach that pushes itself into the center of Eurasia. It's like this absolutely wonderful gift to merchants. And it has on one side natural deep water ports. And then on the other side, where you have Arabia and Basra, you do have to transship things to smaller ships. But you can take advantage of the Euphrates and the Tigris, and with the Euphrates, almost make it to the Mediterranean as well. So the Gulf I think betrays a much more important commercial trading system, sort of the Silk Road of the seas, which in some really transported a lot more goods and people through the Indian Ocean system than through these kind of treks through Central Asia that became important perhaps under the Mongol Empire when the Mongols really wanted to concentrate and sort of monopolize that transshipment and so on. But I would say that the monsoon trade was even more crucial, and even during some parts of the Mongol system. So I also think that this emphasis on trade comes about because of geography, right? So where do we find in most traditional large empires and in large state systems throughout most of human history, 90% of your economic output has come from agriculture. And agriculture, of course, often requires large systems and big states so that you can make the dams and the levees and distribute the water everywhere, get everybody on board, have soldiers to defend the systems and defend all of the crops and everything else, and to expand the amount of land that's being used. What's interesting about the Gulf polities is that from a very ancient period, they were not interested in agricultural production per se. They were interested in import and export. They're interested in making revenues not from the land, but from the number of merchants that they could attract to go through their port, to go to the centers of empire that were surrounding. So that's a very different kind of emphasis, and it leads to a very different kind of attitude towards the economy fundamentally. So you have these sort of exceptions to the world historical rule of the pre-modern period, and in these smaller city-state sort of merchant prince polities along the Gulf. And they're protected in their autonomy by that same geography. So if you look at a map of the Gulf, which I include in my book, you have sort of these incredible fortifications provided by nature for free, which are almost impenetrable to any empire with any sense, right? First, you have the marshes, which provide this massive buffer between the center of Babylon, right, further north, and where the Tigris and Euphrates come together. These marshes and the marsh Arabs and the marsh people have been a constant. And up until Saddam Hussein, he figured he needed to drain the entire marshes in order to stop the rebellions from the marsh Arabs. The buffer between the Gulf and the central government. And when it comes to Iran, you have the Zagros Mountains and these bandars, which are like Norwegian fjords coming out of cutting literally through attempts to control the shore of the Persian side of the Gulf. And then on the Arab side of the Gulf, you have the most impenetrable and difficult deserts and subka winds that literally sandblast you into nothingness and can bury whole armies under sand dunes. So you do not, as an empire, you might want to control the whole Persian Gulf and use this term Persian because the Sassanids and the Persians did try to control the Persian Gulf, but they never actually successfully do that. And that's one of the main points that I make. It's unlike the Mediterranean, which was indeed controlled and centralized and became this dream of restoring the control of the Mare Nostrum of the Roman over a much larger sea. But it's a much smaller space that was never completely controlled by empire, but allowed an opening for these small merchant sort of polities, these ports, port cities, port empire.
I think what you're mentioning about the civilizations is really interesting, how they have a different outlook and a different way of kind of conducting life. And the different geography, I think, does strike at the heart of what we might think the Gulf is. But then you talk about these different polities, these different civilizations. How do they interact with one another? Because obviously they're competing for this kind of import-export business. How are they interacting? How are they, even interacting with their own people?
Yes, that's a fascinating question. It's still very relevant today. It's interesting to see, for example, how Doha and Abu Dhabi, Dubai are sort of rivals with one another and even competing over where we're going to have the best museums, or we're going to who's going to be the real center, who's going to be the one that attracts the most commerce or the most airplanes and the most. And I think what that's part of the history of the Gulf as well, is this competitive dynamic. And it goes back to the medieval and ancient period as well, where you see port cities rise up and then suddenly fall again when another rival port or rival prince either has the resources or the acumen to give a better deal to the merchants. Or a rival prince says, I'm going to be even more welcoming to differences than this other guy who's, if you go to his port, he's going to maybe not accommodate your religious beliefs or practices. So I think that's what's interesting, is that it's a sort of commercial tolerance, right? You have tolerance not because you necessarily want to, but because it helps you attract more merchants. It's not as if it's some sort of ideological principle of tolerance that the West tries to put up as one of, we are the West, we have more tolerance than other places. It's that tolerance actually leads to greater revenues, because the more tolerant you are, the more merchants and the more distant merchants, especially, that's the high level, high commerce, where you get even higher profits. That goes to the prince, that goes to the government through these customs houses. And most of the people, the regular people who are related either through tribe or through obligation, they don't have to pay those taxes, right? But that also means that they have less connection then to the state itself, which is interesting, because without this, there's this idea, no representation, no taxation without representation, but there's also no representation without taxation. It goes the other way too. So that leads to these princes being much more outward focused in many instances, even though they have this issue of trying to also maintain the loyalties of their family and other citizens and tribal groups as well. So it's those who really are the best at balancing those two forces that are the most successful, is sort of the trend that I see in the longer term history of the Gulf.
And it really is interesting to see, and you do show it throughout the book, how those pressures do continue through millennia in the region. But you've mentioned something within your answer there that I really think I'd be a poor interviewer if I didn't pick on. You're talking about tolerance and the idea of religion. Yeah. How does that contribute to the spread of Islam in the area? Because I think traditionally, and we see the area as being predominantly Muslim, but has it always been that way, or has it contributed to the spread of the religion?
I would actually argue that increasingly today, the Gulf is, if you look at the sheer number of people, yes, you do have a lot of the guest workers coming in are Muslim, but a large number of them are non-Muslim as well. If you look at the Philippines, and you see the princes and the rulers actually sponsoring Catholic churches. But yes, I think your point about the spread of Islam is interesting. I think the act of commerce and creating commercial networks gives an incentive for people, especially in the ports that are the source of a lot of this commerce along the shore of Africa, all the way even to Indonesia and along the South Asia. If you convert to Islam, it sort of lubricates the commercial process, and you become sort of more of a point person for trade. Especially if you convert and join maybe one of these Sufi networks as well, which even allows for more kind of camaraderie across vast distances. And these trust systems and a sort of, if you look at Islamic law, there is a lot of commercial law under it, right? And that also helps allow for these networks to be maintained and established as well. So yes, I think it leads to a very different sort of conversion to Islam than the original sort of expansion of the Arab conquests. At the same time, there isn't necessarily, even with the initial conquests and afterwards, there isn't a lot of advantage on a large scale to trying to get people to convert to Islam, because then you have also created a competitor who is then at the equal level as you. So it's sort of this interesting two-way dynamic. Yes, you want people to convert because you think that it will save their soul, but then at the same time, if they convert, people who convert can't be enslaved. And there is slavery in the Gulf of a long history. Of course, it's been changed today. Some people would argue that it's continuing on with some of the with the humanitarian abuses that have occurred in some instances, with the construction projects in some cases. But I think it's this interesting tension that exists where, yes, you do want people to convert, but then if they do convert, it doesn't necessarily give you a particular advantage. So I wouldn't say that religion here is as driving of a force of understanding people's motivations as I think has been sometimes presented, as opposed to other regions in the Middle East where it definitely, I think, is. So I think if you look at the area around Jerusalem, you see people doing all sorts of stupid things against their economic interests, all because of a religious inspiration, like the Crusaders going all the way over there to this land that isn't nearly as productive as, say, England or France, and destroying their families and destroying everything, all because of religious inspiration. The Gulf is kind of like this antithesis of that. And I think that's interesting. You see Abraham actually leave the Gulf and go to the Holy Land. It's kind of like these two different models of the Middle East, because it's not necessarily sacred land that actually gives it some more openness in a way. And that's something that the Gulf rulers have been very careful to kind of present. And even what they did, Osama bin Laden, one of his reasons, not that we should listen to his reasons, but one of the reasons that he said, oh, we have this attack on the United States because of the U.S. bases in Saudi Arabia, which is supposed to be the Holy Land, right? Of Mecca and Medina. Well, the Gulf rulers of Qatar and UAE and Bahrain said, oh, we're not technically, we're not in the Holy Land. We're just this commercial land. We're just this open land. We don't have to follow the same strict rules as you do around the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. And that allowed them to both welcome U.S. forces, but also welcome U.S. aid and security guarantees that have allowed them to prosper, even under the shadow of threats such as the expansionist policy of Saddam Hussein, which follows an ancient tradition of Babylonian rulers trying to come in and control these trade networks, or of Iran, which follows an ancient process of the Persians trying to come over and control these trade networks. So they bring in an outside power like the United States, which ends up solidifying those geographical protections that were provided in the past, but that have become somewhat more porous today due to technological change. But because you have the United States there, and the protection afforded by the United States, like Kuwait gets invaded, and the United States is like, nope. That's basically just as good, if not better, than having a vast marshland that is preventing your troops from coming across and taking over.
It's very interesting to see, the different values and ideas of the Gulf continue, as you've said, and the Gulf being that kind of antithesis to the Holy Lands, and it does create that really interesting dynamic, and particularly when you're bringing in the Americans. So I think that strikes at a kind of different question there, a different kind of approach. Is how does this region begin to interact with Europeans and Western civilizations, and what kind of impact does it have on their trade and their way of operating?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. One of the arguments I make in my chapter on Portugal, because Portugal, the coming of the Portuguese in the 16th century, you have Albuquerque coming in quite violently, coming through and bursting through with his carracks and cannons and everything, saying, oh, I'm just going to conquer this place, just like they conquered Al-Andalus. They even called the people of Hormuz and of the Persian Gulf, they called them Moors, because that's what they were used to over centuries of conflict, 7 centuries of conflict that became the Reconquista in Spain. That same sort of thinking and same sort of ideology was just transported to the Indian Ocean. Right? But what they've quickly found out is, we're not actually dealing with the same situation here, because whereas the Reconquista was an acquiring of land, sometimes very valuable land, again, agricultural land, and when it came to acquiring Hormuz, it was about acquiring markets and acquiring ports and commerce. The Portuguese had to learn very quickly the same sort of modus vivendi that the previous rulers had also used, right? Which is tolerate, encourage trade, lower taxes, even create factories for the exporting of goods. So you have what the Portuguese really bring that does change some of the dynamics is fort architecture, right? Which is incredibly significant because they have these really amazing forts that they bring in that they perfected over centuries of war in the Iberian Peninsula and over North Africa. And those are quite effective in many instances. Also, their maritime technology when it comes to their ships as well, they're able to sort of exact almost like piracy, but a type of imperial piracy. This taxation, this cartas of other local ships. They don't get all of them though. And you see, for the most part, commerce kind of going around the Portuguese and the Portuguese having to adapt themselves to the system as it existed there. And you even see the Portuguese realizing, and it took them even 20 years to realize this, but they eventually took over the customs house and like, oh, this is where all the money is. Yes. Customs duties. Yes, that's where the money is. And they use the customs revenue to pay for the priest's salary, even for the choir boys and the organ and all the Augustinian monks. And some of that even goes eventually to go into the bishop. So when the Inquisition tried to find its way to Hormuz, right, it was much more successful in the more agriculturally based colonial centers, in Brazil and in Goa. When it made it to Hormuz, the Inquisition just fell apart. It didn't really do much. I mean, there were a couple of mosques that may have been destroyed, but then they were built right back up, and there were no real forced conversions. And you wonder why did this happen? Why did Hormuz kind of avoid the inquisitorial process? And it's because even the church itself had an interest in maintaining the status quo, which is commerce over religion. So that's, I think, an interesting example. And what happened eventually is that even the technology that the Portuguese brought in was integrated into a new Gulf-based empire that came from the Omanis, right? Who took over the Portuguese forts. They're like, oh, great, now we have all these great forts that the Portuguese have abandoned. And we'll just create our own empire going all the way down, sort of replicating all the way down the coast of Africa. And then you end up the reverse of the expected model. But the expected model is that the Europeans come in, maybe another European empire comes and takes over, and it's all these Europeans who dominate everything. In the Gulf, you have a European empire come in, they're replaced not by another European, but by the Omanis, who are this pre-existing, really fascinating example of sort of local maritime empire that prospers, admittedly perhaps under some of the influence of the British Empire, but does prosper with some autonomy up until 1850s.
And what are these cities primarily trading that is generating them such huge amounts of money that the Portuguese want to get involved and the British want to get involved?
Silk was one of the main products that led to huge revenue coming through. Also, you have the spices coming particularly from the Moluccas and from these places that still had secret. They still didn't understand where some of the cinnamon it didn't just flow down the rivers. Eventually, though, there were attempts to kind of, even with cloves, to transplant them in other contexts. So Zanzibar is not a native clove. It's not where cloves grow natively, but they were kind of secretly transported over there, for example, and then it became this center for clothes, which are incredibly valuable. So I think because spices can be held in very small, fairly small containers, but have a critically high price, that allows the return of investment necessary for ships where you might have one out of every three be destroyed or a shipwreck before they get even back to the markets. Those are the types of goods that were being traded when it came to high-end commerce. But there's also, of course, the more local commerce happening as well. Pearls is another important high-value commodity that was being traded, and horses as well, because the climate of Arabia, for some reason, really created these wonderful horse breeds that were constantly in demand in India, and even for breeding in the Mediterranean as well.
So how does the region go from this point of making large amounts of revenue on spices and pearls and horses into being a region which is making vast amount of money off oil?
Oh, yes. And another one was coffee, though, too. Sorry.
I can't.
You can't forget coffee.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, oil. What's interesting about oil is that it's not entirely different from pearls, right? Because pearl prices were determined by an international market. They're a commodity that requires transportation to distant places, right, over vast distances. And the merchants involved in the extraction of the pearls, the rulers and the merchants involved, it's sort of a system that isn't completely different from what developed with oil. What is different with oil is that it is much less labor intensive once you get all the oil rigs established. So what that does is it does tend to concentrate revenue either within the state or the rulers of that state. And there were some interesting instances where, because the British and the American oil companies were competing with one another, even though they were erstwhile allies on another level, right? So, of trying to offer the best terms to particular rulers, they personalized these revenues in a way that wasn't the case under the pearl market. So under the pearl markets, the idea was that the pearl banks, once you went out into the pearl banks, they were kind of this common area. Anybody could access them who had the who had the ships, who had the ability to go and use them. There were some agreements that developed as well, so it wasn't necessarily that simple. It wasn't like, oh, this is only our pearl bank and not your pearl bank. There was kind of a shared resource happening there. With oil, it's very different. What happened is in a lot of these agreements, it was personally given to the ruler, and that has changed to some extent, but there's still this understanding among some rulers, oh, well, this is actually our personal wealth that's coming in. And we might share it with the state or with society or our clients or other groups, but it's going to us individually. And that, I think, is a crucial change that happened as the British and American oil companies were competing for influence. At the same time, one has to say that I think, as I mentioned earlier, in order to make those claims to the oil, and when it comes to international negotiations and treaties and boundary disputes, you do see arise again and again the need of the ruler to maintain his allegiance to particular groups outside of his own tribe who have claims to land where the oil actually is. So I think, again, it's a complex picture. As these boundaries become more stabilized, and I think as the revenue even increases further, the risk is that there is going to be more distance between the ruler and the ruled. And if that becomes too tenuous, I think there could be some problems developed. So there's an incentive, I think, for the rulers to maintain some of these traditional connections, especially because and one of the ways they do that actually is to bring in migrant labor, because if you're a migrant laborer, there's no risk that you will fundamentally displace someone who has the rights of a citizen within the Gulf system as it's constructed today, because at any moment a migrant laborer could be forced to leave, and they don't have the same rights and status necessarily as a citizen. So even if you have 90% of your population be non-citizen, There are some citizens who have kind of protested against this. There have been moves for what's called Emiratization or Qatarization, that we need more of these jobs for us. But there hasn't been a serious kind of reaction to the extent that we see even in the United States, right? Imagine if what kind of the United States elected Trump based on a deportation rhetoric. Imagine if 90%, not just 10% or even less of the population was migrant labor. What that would do to our politics, right? But somehow in the Gulf, you're able to have relative political stability. You do have some, blowback, but relatively little comparatively with this massive labor system where you're not using the labor of the local citizen population. You're deliberately kind of exporting it to these migrant laborers within your own land and your own country. So I think that's a really interesting distinction, and I think it grows out of this long understanding in the Gulf that comes from historical memory that the best way to be successful is in fact to open your doors to these large populations from outside.
I think it's absolutely fascinating just how important historical memory is in the region, even for claims on those oil fields, as you're saying, within bounds of loyalty and even trading as well. And I think it's an absolutely fascinating point on that. But I have a final fun question for you, as I do for all guests on the podcast. You have lived and worked in the Gulf, as you mentioned earlier in the podcast. But what was your favorite thing about living there?
Gosh, well, I highly recommend, once you're done with your PhD, Jackson, you should try to get a fellowship at NYU Abu Dhabi and do a research fellowship there, because what's great is they give you a lot of latitude and flexibility and funding to go and travel wherever you want to go. So I rented a Land Rover and I went deep into the mountains, into the hinterlands of the United Arab Emirates, and then also into the Musandam Peninsula, which is part of Oman, the Sultanate of Oman now. And you can see people continuing their traditional ways of life that existed since the pre-oil times. And that, for me, was a really eye-opening and wonderful experience, to go deep into the Liwa Oasis to see that the date farming system that existed even well through the 1960s and 70s is still a part of that society. And I think that, to me, was sort of this favorite part of my time there, because you do get this sense when you're in the major cities, how much of this heritage and how much of this presentation is really authentic. There's this crisis of authenticity, I think, that comes out, especially, I think, among Westerners for whom this is maybe their first time visiting a Middle Eastern country. Maybe it's the first time they've ever been there was to go to Dubai, and they're like, oh, well, Dubai isn't even, it's just like going to, I don't know, Florida or something. It's not. But if you stay there long enough and you go deep enough and you understand sort of the continued influence of these traditions and cultures, you realize that there is an authenticity behind it, and that it's not all just a manufactured presentation. So that, to me, was probably my favorite part. And just Musandam itself, I mean, it really is like this unexplored country of vast fjords, and the water is incredible. If you look at sometimes just pictures of the water, it really is like that, where you just go deep down and crystal clear. And it can be a problem when it comes to sharks, though. I've cut my foot several times on the shark rocks, and I was on a dhow and traveling to get to Telegraph Island, which is where there was this isolated British unit that was setting up telegraph lines to go to India, and it's on this really barren island out in the middle of the Musandam Peninsula. So I wanted to go there, but I also wanted to go swimming, and I cut my foot, and the nakhoda, or the captain of the ship, was like, come back, because he could see this pool of sharks. I was like, ah!
I think that's great. I think that's a great answer to that question. Great answer.
If I had been eating my sharks, this book would not be here.
Yeah.
So it's thanks to that captain that this book is here, really. So, yeah.
Well, that's the perfect segue on to the next question, actually. If people want to go and buy a copy of The Center of the World, where can they go?
Oh, there's lots of places. You can go to Amazon, of course. And you can go to Barnes and Noble or other venues as well. They have a good distribution system with the University of California Press. And yes, please write a review of the book as well and post it.
And then
somewhere.
if people want to interact with you and learn more about your work, where can they go?
Where can they go? Oh, they can go to my faculty webpage. I have several. You could even just do a Google search of my name and you'll see all my books pop up there on the Google search.
Fantastic. Well, I'll make sure everything's linked below so people go and grab a copy of The Center of the World and go see the rest of your work. But thank you very much for coming on, Alan.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast. Hello and welcome to the History of Jackson podcast, the podcast where we bring up-to-date historical research to you in an accessible and digestible way.